Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second webinar of the Trade Policy Exchange. And so just before we start, I would like to ask you to please follow us on LinkedIn if you want to be informed of our next events. The next one will be precisely still in April, on the 28th of April at 3:30 p.m. On the state of the plurilateral negotiation on e-commerce at the WTO. So this roundtable is the first trade policy exchange webinar on trade and the environment. And we can still, we can all agree that there is a momentum to talk about trade, the link between trade and the environment. Because as we all know, the COVID crisis has prompted a discussion on the relationship between trade and non-trade interests. And we have witnessed a new initiative at the WTO on trade and the environment, and I will mention a few of them, which is the structured discussion on trade and sustainability, and also the one on trade in plastics. But still, there is a question that is unanswered and is not even put on the agenda, is the relationship between the trade regime and the legal framework pertaining to climate change. And we've seen a lot of initiative concerning unilateral measures to tackle the global challenge, which is the global warming and climate change. And still, it's not put on the agenda. And a few years ago, James Backus tabled a proposal, which is he launched the idea of a climate waiver. And I think it's still a bit, it's a bold proposal, but still a bit divisive. And it's, I think, an opportunity to revive the debate around this and to talk about not only the climate waiver, but also the relationship between trade and the environment, and whether we should push for this question to be on the agenda at the WTO. So I'm going to introduce the guests. So James Backus, of course. I don't know if I need to introduce you, but so you're a distinguished professor of global affairs, and you're the director of the Center for Global Economic and Environmental Opportunity of the University of Central Florida. You were a judge at the WTO appellate body, and also a former congressman, former member of the US Congress, and also a former US negotiator. Also with us, we have Mr. Jean-Marie Pogal, who is the permanent representative of France to the WTO, and is also a former chairman of the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment. Also Tracy Epps, and thank you very much, Tracy, because I know it's what, 2:30 a.m. in Wellington. So thank you very much for being with us. So Tracy is a trade law consultant with Chapman Tripp. It's a law firm located in New Zealand. She's also teaching law at the University of Otago in New Zealand, and she's a former legal advisor and negotiator with New Zealand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And also Emily Rees, who is a trade analyst. You're the founder of Trade Strategies, and you're also a senior fellow at ESIPE, which is the European Center for International Political Economy. So I think we have quite a good mix of legal, economic, political expertise. And we're going to start with Mr. James Backus. Please make your point, make the case for the climate waiver, and I give you 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It's good to be with you and with my three other friends and fellow travelers for trade and sustainable development. I look forward to when we can be together in Geneva, other than virtually. When I left the appellate body in 2003, I returned to the climate campaign, in which I have been much involved during my time as a member of Congress back even before the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. In 2009, I went to Copenhagen for COP15, and while there gave a speech in which I explained that the trading system and the climate regime are on a collision course if they did not begin to work together to deal with the nexus between trade and climate change. The response there was basically, what in the world is he talking about? Climate has nothing to do with trade, and trade has nothing to do with the climate. Here, a dozen years later, I'm afraid that my prophecy will soon come true. The European Union is on the verge of proposing a border carbon adjustment mechanism, a measure that would restrict trade for climate reasons. The response thus far of the United States has been a statement by climate envoy John Kerry in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, in which he was asked how we were going to make certain that China abides by its climate commitments. He pointed to the pending European proposal. And my guess is when the Europeans move forward with this proposal, the reaction in Washington will not be to condemn it, but rather to emulate it. And meanwhile, many of the developing countries in the world are fearful of what they anticipate will be green protectionism. And at this point, while commendably members of the WTO have at long last begun to talk about sustainable development and about ways in which WTO reform can advance the cause of sustainable development, they still haven't grappled with this issue. There are several different ways in which we could approach the coming collision between the trade and climate regimes. We could simply wait and let WTO jurists, when we have them again, decide what's a climate measure and what's not. That's less than ideal. We could try to amend the WTO rules. Well, we've been trying to amend WTO rules for 20 years now, mostly without success in the Doha round. That seems to be less than ideal as an approach. We could ignore WTO rules, as the Trump administration largely did for 4 years. That's not an approach that I think any of us would support. Or we can adopt a climate waiver. That would enable us to experiment with the notion of finding the right balance between trade and climate change and identifying which kinds of measures would be permitted by WTO members that restrict trade for climate reasons. None of these options is currently feasible, but I would say the best one by far is what I have proposed, a WTO climate waiver. Now, we all know, I think, that if I could assemble a team of half a dozen or so former members of the appellate body, we could craft a measure that would thread the legal needle of existing WTO rules and be consistent with WTO obligations. And most likely that would be some type of a border tax adjustment. Therefore, the best approach legally would be some kind of a carbon tax. But the European Union, the United States of America, others, for purely political reasons, are reluctant to embrace a carbon tax. It's called a tax, and no politician ever wants to vote for a tax. So they're more likely to engage in second best solutions. That seems to be the likely approach of the European Union, which seems bent on trying to do this in concert with its emissions trading system, which has been in place for some time. A problem with a border tax adjustment is that there are some unanswered questions in the WTO jurisprudence about it. But in my view, a border carbon adjustment would be permissible currently under Article 2 of the GATT. Yet it would be better if the members of the WTO adopted a legal interpretation, their exclusive right, that said so. What about the kinds of measures we're most likely to have that are border carbon adjustment measures, if you will? They're likely to take the form of all kinds of other restrictions. In my view, what we need to do is bring the climate COP and the WTO together to try to craft a climate waiver that could be put in place by the 164 members of the COP who are also members of the WTO. I have proposed that to further carbon pricing and to facilitate the necessary green transition in the global economy, the core of the content of a WTO climate waiver should be a waiver from the application of WTO rules for trade restrictive national measures that first discriminate based on the amount of carbon or other greenhouse gases consumed or emitted in making a product. Second, fit the definition of a climate response measure as defined by the climate COP. And three, do not discriminate in a manner that constitutes a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or a disguised restriction on international trade. And now, this formulation gives rise to a number of concerns. I'll mention a few of them, and then I'll turn the discussion over to the others here and respond to questions later on. One is, if we're going to agree on measures that are permitted that restrict trade for climate reasons, then we're going to have some agreed way of gauging what emissions are. And at this point, after many years, the COP has not agreed on a common metrics. And it needs to do so. We're not there yet. There are all kinds of nuances to that we can discuss later. Second, you'll note that the second prong of my proposal was that the measures fit the definition of a climate response measure as defined by the climate COP. The problem here is that the COP has not defined a climate response measure. They've talked around the issue for 20 years, but have generally treated the topic of trade as it relates to this issue as a taboo. That has to stop. The climate COP has to define a climate response measure, or it will be defined eventually in WTO dispute settlement by WTO judges, which is less than ideal, although it could be workable on a case-by-case basis. But I don't think it's what either the climate regime or the trade regime desire. In addition, I'd like to point out, lastly, one more aspect of this proposal and why I think it's necessary. If you read what the Europeans have published so far about their proposed border carbon adjustment mechanism, and we still don't know the lineaments of it as a measure, you will see that very smartly, the EU has said over and over again that we will do this consistently with our WTO obligations. The problem with that is that, legally speaking, saying does not make it so. When a WTO jurist in dispute settlement looks at the European measure, they will be looking at the revealing architecture and structure of the measure. I think I'm citing myself in Japan alcohol there, but they will be looking at how the measure is actually structured in terms of its effects. And if it has economic motivations that are revealed in that revealing architecture, then it will run afoul of any hope it may have of being excused under the general exceptions of Article 20 of the GATT. It is perfectly possible for a national measure that restricts trade for climate reasons to, on the one hand, be inconsistent with WTO obligations, but on the other hand, be excused under Article 20. But in order to be excused under Article 20, under one of the potential health or environmental exceptions, then the exclusive reason for the measure must be environmental. It must be the climate. It cannot also be mixed with economic considerations. Now, one of the reasons why I think we need a waiver is that as a practical matter, it's going to be impossible to enact the climate measures that are needed around the world urgently unless we allow economic considerations to be taken into account. The measures we're likely to see, whatever description they are given, are most likely to have mixed motives. They may be climate measures, but also measures that are taken for economic reasons, maybe misguided. But nevertheless, one of the virtues of my climate waiver proposal, and this is my last point, is that it would allow measures that did have mixed motives. Thus, the mere fact that one motive of a trade restriction in a national measure to address climate change is to protect the domestic and international competitiveness of domestic producers should not, in and of itself, prevent that measure from fitting within the definition of a climate response measure. National measures that address climate change but also restrict trade should not automatically be excluded from the definition of a climate response measure if they are truly intended to address climate change. Thus, certain kinds of discriminatory trade effects, in my view, should be permitted in what is genuinely a climate adaptation or mitigation measure taken by a WTO member. However, and this is the last prong of the waiver, trade discrimination in such a measure should not be permitted if the discrimination is arbitrary or unjustifiable. In addition, a trade restriction should not fall within that definition if the restriction is disguised and is purely a pretext for protectionism, only pretending to have a climate motive. I'll stop here and allow others to weigh in with their comments, critiques, and questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, James. So just to maybe summarize your proposal. So I think it's all based on the premise that there will be a collision between measures to address climate change and at the global level and trade rules. And so this climate waiver purpose to address unilateral measures that actually have to do that can discriminate based on the production process that is not related to the product itself, and which may be discriminatory or found to be prima facie inconsistent with the GATT. And so in this case, without a climate waiver, you may try to resort to Article 20 exception. And the waiver actually makes sure that there is no problem to determine whether or not it falls under the scope of Article 20, because it can still be an issue. And also, judges would not rule on the necessity, proportionality. I think it's very technical, and leaving that to a judge.
One footnote, just to clarify, if indeed the measure is a carbon tax that meets the definition of a border tax adjustment.
Yeah.
Your Article 2 of the GATT, then there is no violation.
Absolutely.
So there is no need for recourse to Article 20. That would be by far preferable if there were the political will to enact carbon taxes.
Yeah, because it must be specified that other regulatory measures that are non-tax measure might be inconsistent, more easily inconsistent with WTO law, of course. And so the problem, I would not say the problem, but there are two challenges with your proposal, and you recognize it. it comes with conditions. So the first one is there need to be consensus on the measurement of the amount of carbon. And there is no consensus yet, as far as I know. And the second one, we need a clear definition of a climate response measure. And one of the issue is the competitiveness component. As you mentioned, there is always another motivation than the protection of the environment. And it can be legitimate because otherwise government might not actually take those very necessary measures. It's just to summarize it a bit. And I would like to know, I'm just asking the other guests here, what they think about this premise. Do you think there is a collision between the two, as James Bacchus underlined? What's your take on that? I'm going to ask maybe Tracy.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Well, really with everything James said, and that there is, this looming conflict, and that we really need to do something about it. And it's really interesting, actually, for me. 10 years ago, I co-authored a book on trade and climate change, and it seems so long ago now.
Very good book. I've read it.
Oh, thank you. I'm sure all the great ideas were Andrew Green's, not mine. But no, we talked then about how urgent it was. And, 10 years later, we're still talking about it. So, yeah, I absolutely agree. And if I just add one thing, when I sort of first thought about the climate waiver concept, I was perhaps a little skeptical because of, the difficulties of negotiating, and I guess the sort of common response you might get from some officials that, well, the rules, do provide the flexibility. Countries can take these measures right now. But, the more I thought about it, the more, I've just, I do believe that something like this is necessary. And just really briefly, something that really struck me the other day, I was reading an article that my ex-colleague at MFAT, Hunter Nottage, wrote on the WTO website in the history section about the history of the GATT. And he wrote about, how back in 1941, Churchill and Roosevelt met and they agreed on this Atlantic Charter that set out, the basis for cooperation after the war. And it talked about the importance of economic cooperation. And, they obviously didn't want what had happened in the past to happen again. And it just really struck me of, the vision, and Hunter writes about this, right? The vision they had, the courage they had to actually go ahead and negotiate the GATT. And it sort of struck me that I guess in that situation, you could see what had happened, but climate change, I guess, is still something that people, I think, find hard to really, truly imagine what's going to happen. But it seems to me that the potential crisis is far greater than what happened last century. So if leaders had the courage back then, it just really seems like this is a moment where they need to find that kind of courage again. So sorry, I've probably said too much, but I just sort of wanted to start with that, because the more I thought about these kinds of really big picture issues, the more I really do agree with the premise.
Thanks. Jean-Marie?
Well, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for the invitation. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to pay tribute to the vista of James a few years ago when he raised this issue. And my point on the premise is that I think not only the premises are grounded, but I think the situation that he was foreseeing at this time is already happening. And let me give you a few data about that. The key issue is what we call carbon leakages. That means if one country does some efforts to fight climate change, does he have a risk that the industries would transfer elsewhere and the emissions would go elsewhere? And this is not a theoretical phenomenon. It is happening now. And according to some econometric estimates that we have in my ministry, we have an estimation that the range of carbon leakage may be located between 5 and 30% of the reduction of emissions. That means if country A reduces from 100 ton its carbon emission, then this carbon emission would pop up somewhere else in a country which does not have the same policy, up to 30%, which would nullify and impair, to use classical WTO lexicon, the efforts and the carbon response. And if you take the example of my country, for instance, France, when we look at our carbon footprints between 1995 and 2015, what we can see is that we have first on the domestic emission reduced by a range of 20%. So to some extent, we did our homework, minus 20% on domestic emission. At the same time, the imported carbon emission are evaluated to have been rising up to 70%. So that's the second phenomenon. And the overall balance of our carbon footprint is now plus 7%. So that means we are off track, not because of what we did, but because of what we imported in terms of global consumption. So political choices have to be made there, and I agree with some of what has been said. A decision have to be taken. For the EU, the decision and the direction is very clear. We want to reach carbon neutrality in 2050, and if we want to achieve that, we need to reduce our emission by 55% before 2030. So how do we do that if we do not have, of course, the first best solution, which would be a universal carbon price? How do we do that if we have a different carbon price on our domestic market and on our import? So this is why it's true that we are coming with a carbon adjustment mechanism. We are waiting for a proposition from the Commission, so I would not comment the details. My country has been tabling propositions on this publicly. Several ministers of the EU just expressed themselves this week to call for this adjustment mechanism. There are two features that need to be kept in mind. As James was recalling, we really want to be WTO compatible, and we think it's possible. We might have some later discussion on that. And we really want to integrate the fact that developing countries are fearful of those mechanisms. It's very much something that we are aware of. And I think the EU, I cannot talk for the EU, but at least my country, and it was said by the letter of those ministers this week, want to go for a just climate transition. So really integrate the concerns of developing countries in the way we are going to design this mechanism. But the fact is, it is happening now. So yes, I do share the premises.
Okay, thank you. There is a question I would like to ask you and Emily as well. The first thing, I would like to know whether you would agree on discussing this at the WTO, because basically we all agree we need to do something to protect the environment and tackle climate change. But do you agree with the proposition of James Backus that we can foresee a collision with two regimes, and that we need to discuss this at the WTO? And because I've noticed that many governments who are taking measures tend to think that we should not discuss that because it would amount to admitting that what they are doing is inconsistent, which I do not think. But I just would like to have your take on that. And then I would like to ask a question to Emily, because she works with companies. Do you think there is uncertainty around that? And also an advantage I see with the climate weather is that it may be a mean to avoid a chilling effect. I mean, if the EU wants to implement a measure and it takes years to make sure that it's not discriminatory, and and so on and so forth, given the emergency we're in, that might be a problem as well. So is it a way also to solve that?
Thank you, Stephanie, and it's a pleasure to be here to discuss this, and especially thank you to James for coming with this rich proposal on the climate waiver. I think it's really given us all a lot of food for thought. Stephanie, on your latter question, will this be discussed in the WTO? It's going to be discussed in the WTO because the EU is going to go ahead with the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And if we see the discussions that have already been taking place and the questions that have been coming out in the WTO regarding the European Green Deal, for instance, I think that gives us an indication that this is not going to go away. So it needs to be addressed. When we're talking about the firm level, so perhaps the product level, right, of putting in measures such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism, obviously what we need to look at is the discriminatory nature of the measure and whether it's arbitrary or not. I mean, those really are going to be the two salient points that we're going to look at this with. And that's where the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which we should have a first proposal coming out soon in June, should already start providing us with an overview of even the complexity of imposing a measure to internalize these externalities and counteract the carbon leakage that Jean-Marie discussed. Essentially, from the firm level, one of the biggest concerns I would imagine would be the fact that you would have, if I could take a hypothetical example here, it is being suggested that the carbon coefficient, the one that we've just said has not been really, the methodology really hasn't been designed yet, or at least agreed to, that it will be a blanket carbon coefficient that will be applied per sector, per country. And that in of itself can have, I mean, quite a lot of effect in terms of capping a lot of the ambition for firms to decarbonize. And I think that's where we're going to have to be quite careful. If I take the example, if we have two firms, firm A and firm B, in a third country to the EU, both exporting products to Europe under this carbon border adjustment mechanism, and firm A, for instance, has invested massively in its own renewable energy sources and better process and production methods, opening that door straight away. Firm B, let's say, is relying on the national energy grid, which might be less than pristine, and is not investing so much in terms of decarbonization of its process and production, right? So if we put a blanket coefficient for that country, then essentially we're saying that firm A that might have a better carbon footprint than firm B should be judged in the same way and will have to pay the same tax at the border, right? Or whatever, the adjustment mechanism at the border based on the European ETS. The question then is, are we then disincentivizing firm A to actually carry out those investments in that continuous improvement of decarbonizing the process and production method in order to reach the European Union if it has to pay the same tax at the border as firm B? So I think these, when we're going to be discussing these measures, if we do start looking at product level, then it gets, indeed, it gets quite complex when we look at the design of the measure.
Thanks, Emily. I'm just wondering, there is no doubt those measures will be discussed at the WTO, in particular the European measure. I'm just wondering to what extent WTO members are ready to have a discussion on maybe a possible reform, as James suggested, not necessarily on possible climate weather, but some amendments to make sure that we can actually address the looming collision between the trade regime and rules on climate change. So I'm just wondering whether that's possible or not. Do you think, can you foresee this happening?
Are you asking me?
Not necessarily you, but...
Well, let me say, I agree with Emily. Whether they're ready to discuss this or not, they're going to be discussing it because the European Union is going to move ahead. And I think that will unavoidably trigger a very far-reaching discussion. And indeed, this issue is complex. There's limited time here to go into the numerous nuances. I have written 3 papers on this proposal for those who are interested in delving more deeply into it. First of all, I discussed it in my book, The Willing World, 3 years ago. And I've written 3 papers for CIGI, C-I-G-I, online.org since that time. The first is the case for a WTO Climate Waiver, The second is the content of a WTO climate waiver. And the third is, what is a climate response measure? In addition, I go into even greater length on these and other aspects of WTO reform in a new book I have forthcoming from Cambridge University Press late this year. These are indeed complex issues. I see that a number of people in raising question have mentioned some of these complexities. The papers will show that I answer some of these questions as best I can in the papers. For example, in defining a climate response measure, you're not going to be able to do that in one paragraph. I have suggested that a model could be the illustrative list of export subsidies in Annex 1 to the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, which has proved useful and durable over the past 25 years. It's a non-exhaustive list. We're not going to be able to anticipate every kind of climate-related trade restriction. We should have a list of those that we think are okay that is not exhaustive. And this could address some questions such as, what about subsidies? What about what if these subsidies include local content requirements or other similar issues? Because ultimately, as with all else that falls within the scope of the WTO treaty, if it ends up in WTO dispute settlement, it's going to be judged on a case-by-case basis. One other example, and I'll stop for now. The Europeans, and I have several proteges who work very ably at DG Trade, and I admire them and applaud them, are doing their best to make certain this is WTO compatible, but they're also trying to piggyback this legally on the emissions trading system they have, and that could be fraught with some difficulties. The system may potentially be vulnerable already, for example, with the free allowances it grants. Are those subsidies? I would say that they are, and if they have adverse effects in the marketplace, well, they're inconsistent with the subsidies agreement. I understand also that the EU is talking about simply applying the types of fees that it applies now and on the same basis to importers that it applies currently to domestic producers. Oh, that's fine so far as it goes, but is the EU planning to give these importers a chance to have a say in this? Is there any due process? Is this then even-handed in the sense of, as one example, the appellate body ruling in the shrimp turtle case? And go read the opinion yourself and determine what you think about that. These are the kinds of highly esoteric issues, legal, technical, economic, environmental, and otherwise, that must be grappled with by the members of the WTO, and sooner rather than later.
Thanks very much, James. So I would like to ask a question about the risk and implication if nothing is to change. What are the implication of the status quo? A green trade war? What can be the risk attached to that?
Maybe I can step in at this
They could probably get to the right answer in a case, but that doesn't mean they should be asked to do so.
So this is my personal view, and of course I'm differing all the different that I need to have to the EU level in talking about what should be introduced in the WTO. But what I think that Emily is right. Not only it will happen, but it's already done. I mean, in the Council of Trade in Goods, there are questions which are being made by some members about the WTO, about the European Carbon Adjustment Mechanism, even before it exists. So the debate will probably be introduced through that in that forum. What surprises me, and especially as former chairman of the CTE, the Committee on Trade and Environment, is that the CTE is the only place in the WTO which is non-negotiating and non-implementing. So this is really the place of freedom, where we should have those talks without fearing to be tying our hands. But the fact is, and I can just bring my experience, is that you cannot put the word climate on the agenda of the CTE, because some members would not accept that. They consider that this discussion needs to happen outside of the WTO. So in some way, the natural place to try to develop some constructive exchange of experience, best practice solution is not really used by the members at this stage. I'm not judging it, I'm not taking it as a fact, but which is also informing us about the political feasibility of introducing a discussion on the waiver. Now, the third point, and maybe I'll be challenging you here a little bit, James, on the proposition itself. We do think that it is very possible to have a WTO compatible mechanism based on Article 2, Article 3, possibly, depending on what the measure is. So we really think that there is a way to do a non-discrimination mechanism. And here, and I'm talking personally, not as a French representative, even less an EU, what I have a little bit of a philosophical concern about the waiver proposition is that there is this idea in the WTO that we keep rolling on since the GATT times, that there is some sort of incompatibility between environment and trade. So each time you want to do something environmentally friendly in the WTO, you need to resort to the exception, be it Article 20 or the waiver. So it's not possible to have regular, non-discriminatory trade policy, which is dealing with the environment. I do think that this is wrong. I do think that this is not the rule book. The Marrakesh Agreement really calls for trade agreements incorporating the sustainable development objective. And I'm a little bit afraid that the waiver idea, which has a lot of other merits, which is very robust, might also give credit to the fact that we cannot make environment a normal feature of trade. And this is a little bit of a philosophical challenge that I'll be happy to hear you on.
This is a very good point, Jean-Marie, but I fear that apart from having carbon taxes, which again, I strongly recommend, when I was a member of Congress in 1993, I voted for a carbon tax. So I'm not a newcomer to the issue. But apart from carbon taxes, other trade restrictive climate related measures are going to need to be justified under Article 20, because as the rules are now, they would be violations. This is something that has been ruled again and again in WTO dispute settlement, because basically what you're proposing legally, whether consciously or not, is that we begin to discriminate among products themselves in a like product determination based on how they are made. And over and over again, this has been rejected in GATT councils and WTO jurisprudence, and including by me and my colleagues on the appellate body, dating back to the first cases of the appellate body, because it's not contemplated in the rules, and it's a slippery slope. Because if you can discriminate on the basis of this, then you can discriminate on the basis of that, and that can mean most anything to anybody who has a cause. Many of these causes are going to be worthy, but if you allow discrimination on the basis of all these causes, then you don't have a trading system that will work. I have singled out climate change because it is so important transcendentally to the world. You can make an argument, I think, that the threat to biodiversity has similar consequences, and maybe we'll get there on that too. I discuss that issue at length in my forthcoming book. I haven't written any papers about it, but then you get on to other issues, and it's unclear to me that these issues cannot be dealt with through dispute settlement in a way that works within the current rules. But the urgency of climate change, perhaps also biodiversity, which has not gotten the visibility it deserves, are, I think, of a different category.
Thanks. Tracy, would you like to say something?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess just on that question of, I mean, just sort of thinking about the signaling effect, of having a waiver, does it suggest that maybe, it's not possible to take measures consistently, that the rules aren't, compatible with trade, with climate measures? I mean, I guess
I proposed in my papers, Tracy, that at the outset in a waiver, there'd be a paragraph that says this should in no way imply that it's not possible to take measures that are consistent with WTO obligations for climate reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is possible. It's not going to happen politically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was going to get to that and say, to me, that really sort of, I guess, went a long way to dealing with that issue. And, I mean, it's in terms of the EU taking the carbon, adjustment measures, I guess to me, the waiver idea, one of the great benefits would be, signaling to everyone else that this is something, that you shouldn't just rush to dispute settlement over, that it's something, that we should be working together to find ways to do, but not, I guess, trying to discourage that sort of immediate resort to dispute settlement. So that sort of did also bring up one question for me, that I know one part of your, the content for the waiver would be that a measure couldn't be arbitrarily or unjustifiably discriminatory or a disguised restriction on trade. So I guess my question was, how would you decide that? Because if, say, the EU takes a measure and countries say, well, that's just a disguised restriction, do they then go to dispute settlement over that? Or would you have some mechanism built in around the waiver, like, I don't know, some kind of committee that you, some sort of procedural step that you could go through to try to address that issue. So that was something I was quite
very
interested in.
interesting proposal, Tracy. That had not occurred to me. I may borrow that and footnote you, because we need to avoid dispute settlement on these issues. It could be akin to what I was saying about having a list of a non-exhaustive list of illustrative measures that are permitted. There also ought to be some form of ongoing consultation, either within the Committee on Trade and the Environment or in concert with it or as a subset of it, that can consult with countries in doing these things. I think that's a thoughtful and interesting suggestion.
Actually, just really briefly, something that struck me, I was doing some training for officials here in New Zealand the other day on the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement. And it was really interesting going back and looking at all the case law and how really, there was this sort of raft of case law quite near the beginning. And then it seems like, those principles have been pretty well accepted, and there actually haven't been that many cases recently. And we were sort of talking about why that was, and we we're talking about the committee and how, it seems to have been pretty successful in dealing with a lot of trade concerns. And I guess that got me thinking as well, is this a sort of, something that we could be looking to in this area? It seems so fraught right now.
I think so. But interesting you should raise the SBS agreement, because of course I was there for a lot of those foundational opinions.
Yeah.
But I tend to be mindful of the issues that have not been resolved in dispute settlement and are still out there. Cases that I thankfully did not have to judge. And a lot of the details have been filled into the blanks about the SBS agreement, starting with dispute settlement, but going on from there. But there's still cases that could be brought. Under Article 2, what is a sufficient scientific basis for applying a measure? For that matter, what does it mean to say that something is scientific? And there you get into different views in different parts of the world. Americans and Europeans have a different regulatory approach to risk. Which approach is scientific? Neither, both, one or the other? These are outstanding issues. I guess what I would say is that evidently the trading system can continue to flourish without having all the questions answered.
Yeah.
We've answered a lot of the questions about national treatment, but I could give you a dozen at least that have not yet been asked, so they've not yet been answered. I think it could be the same here. However we construct this waiver, it would be an arduous task. It would not be able to anticipate every situation or every potential measure. So we would have to leave it non-exhaustive and open-ended, at least to an extent. One person raised a question, Stephanie, that I would like to answer online. And that is, in an Article 20 determination, what if you can show that something is consistent with the multilateral environmental agreement? Well, I've long favored amending Article 20 to include a new subparagraph on a list of MEAs, where if you're complying with them, it wouldn't be a violation. The problem here is, for the most part, we'll be dealing with the UNFCCC and the Paris Climate Agreement. And the relationship between the two of them, of course, is legally fraught, as we know. Does Article 3.5 of the UNFCCC apply to the Paris Agreement? No one really knows, but that's one of the issues that would have to be considered in a waiver. But here's the problem with the questioner's proposal. If a country says, well, what I'm doing here with this measure is consistent with my nationally determined contribution under the Paris agreement. Okay, should that be a defense, an automatic defense? Well, we know that these are voluntary pledges. The details of how they're implemented are left to the sovereign countries. And they could be implemented in ways that make sense in terms of the nexus between trade and climate change, in ways that do not. Also, why limit the acceptable and permissible climate/trade measures to those that are part of the implementation of national climate pledges under the Paris Agreement? Those pledges are far less than what they ought to be. Why would we encourage countries only to do what they've already pledged to do when we're very busy all over the world trying to get countries to do more? So I think the issue is more complicated than that. That could be a part of reaching the answer, but I don't think it's necessarily a full answer.
Stephanie, if you allow me to chime in, just on Tracy brought up a very good point on the SPS agreement. I would wonder to what extent actually many of those trade irritants are being actually dealt with under bilateral trade agreements, and the correlation between those two. And that actually brings us to another point, which is if we look at what the European Union's now doing in its bilateral trade deals, it's including all these climate provisions, environmental provisions, right? And I wonder to what extent, if this isn't dealt with appropriately at a WTO level, it will happen more bilaterally. To Jean-Marie's earlier point on the incremental step-by-step of the carbon border adjustment mechanism that's going to come out of the EU shortly, perhaps the question of the arbitrariness of the sectors that are being selected is going to be one of the issues that's going to come up first, I would believe, because going first for steel, when we know that, and trying to decouple that conversation from the question of excess capacity and the economic issues surrounding steel is perhaps, I would say it's a very ambitious starting point for this carbon border adjustment mechanism, even if we know that that sector is highly energy intensive. And finally, I'm really thankful that James brought up the point of the PPMs. Once we open up the question of process and production methods for climate, we're opening up that Pandora's box for all of them. And we mentioned biodiversity, but it's not only biodiversity. There are questions regarding animal welfare, embedded deforestation, labor standards. That is the Pandora's box that opens once we start looking at PPMs in a different light, even if there is a moral justification behind the opening of that debate. So I'd be happy to hear your views on that.
James?
I think Emily is absolutely right. In my new book, I have sections on all of the issues she's just raised. I have concrete suggestions about reforms we need to undertake in all those areas, but I haven't proposed a waiver for any of them. I think we can deal with those issues under the current framework with some additional nuances. There are a number of things that I propose that I think would bring environmental considerations more to the fore, and also other issues in sustainable development that are social and economic, such as labor conditions. For example, I proposed that we change the subsidies rules so that adverse effects would not be comprised entirely of adverse economic effects, but would also include adverse environmental effects. That, I think, could help us discipline subsidies in a way we're not doing now. The I think some of these ideas have been tried out in FTAs. Some of them are still under discussion. The Europeans and the Brazilians are talking about their own pending agreement, and what the Brazilians are and are not doing with respect to the Amazon. On this issue, I side with the Europeans. And let me say also, I may be picking holes in their potential carbon border adjustment mechanism legally, but I applaud the European Union wholeheartedly for moving ahead significantly and substantially and in a concrete way to try to deal with the nexus between trade and climate change.
Thank you.
The details of how they do so will, of course, matter under WTO rules in the absence of a waiver, and even with a waiver, they still have to meet those terms.
Thank you very much. Our time is running, and we need some time to answer the audience questions. So I have one last question to our guests. It's about the climate response measure and the definition. And as you mentioned, James, there is a competitiveness component. And I'm just wondering to what extent that is acceptable, how to deal with that. I think it's a very tricky question, especially for developing countries mainly. So I would like to have your take on that.
Well, once again, in my pending publication, I talk at length about the fears of developing countries, that this will simply descend into green protectionism. And there, if we want developing countries to be green, we're going to have to help them in trying to become green. This, I think, requires that we take approaches perhaps modeled on the trade facilitation agreement, but go considerably beyond them. We need to provide developing countries with the technology transfer, the technical assistance, the capacity building, and frankly, the financial assistance that they need, and in many respects have been promised to try to become more responsive domestically to climate concerns. My country and others have promised developing countries dating back years now that we would provide them with billions of dollars in resources to meet their climate obligations, and have not done so. There is a provision in the TRIPS agreement on intellectual property, for those of you who are not WTO zealots, that commits developed countries to provide technology transfer to the least developed countries in the world. The list of, I think it's 48 right now, largely sub-Saharan African countries and island states that have an annual per capita income of $1,000 or less. We're supposed to be providing them with technology to help them develop in a green way. We're not doing so. Most countries aren't even reporting, and where they are reporting, they're reporting on, basically a shell game. They're claiming that things they were doing anyway are new things that they're doing to comply with this mandatory obligation. I don't think the developed world is doing by any means what it should be doing to help the developing world. By the way, in terms of the pending European measure, if they exclude the least developed countries from these restrictions, I think that that should be permissible. I don't see that as arbitrary or unjustifiable at all. But on the other hand, if the United States decides that we're going to impose a border or carbon restriction based on our view that other countries are keeping their climate obligations, something of an irony given our recent past, and decide that we're going to do that only on China and Chinese products, I think that would be a problem. That would seem to me to be arbitrary. So while generally the economic question would come into consideration under the subparagraphs, and while we would, with the waiver, eliminate what is now a bar to economic considerations for eligibility provisionally, as justification for a general exception in the subparagraphs, there would be certain economic elements that could come into play in the chapeau of Article 20, but I don't think that it would require any general change in the body of WTO Article 20 jurisprudence. I think rather this would be a more limited and separate jurisprudence relating to this particular waiver.
Thank you.
An analogy here would be to the Lome waiver in the famous bananas case that I had the privilege and the burden of judging a couple of decades ago.
Thank you. Would anyone want to add something before we move to the Q&A?
Perhaps just on the last point, which is that of whether a sub-waiver should be applied to the less developed countries in the case of the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. That is still very much under discussion prior to the June proposal, as we understand it. The Commission being rather more in favor of going down that line, and the European Parliament pushing back, and would see more a question of using the financial resources from the adjustment mechanism to then be used as a support measure for climate initiatives in those countries. So,
well, I hope they look historically at how so very much these least developed countries have done to cause climate change. Of course, I'm being ironic here. They've done virtually nothing to cause climate change, and yet they're the first to be harmed by it, and they're being harmed by it every day. So I would think that my European friends, and also I would hope my former colleagues in the Congress of the United States would see their way to exclude these countries from any such restrictions.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. So now we're going to have a Q&A session, and I will ask Jana Dreyer from Borderlex, she's our media partner, to start. Jana. Just 1 minute. She has apparently she cannot connect, so I will take a few questions from the audience, and we have a lot of questions. So I start with one from Ronald Steenblick. is asking, is James Backus concerned to allow climate-motivated action that deal with the competitiveness effect of increased cost of compliance on fuel consumers? Or does he envisage also exempting measures such as production subsidies for domestic renewable energy technology firms, or feed-in tariffs for the deployment of RE plants with local content requirements attached?
I believe my answer would be to recall my suggestion for an illustrative list of measures that would be compatible with the waiver, a list that would be non-exhaustive. We might include some subsidies on that list, but personally, I would not include local content requirements. And there, I would do that not only for trade reasons, but also for environmental reasons. There's plenty of empirical evidence showing that local content requirements diminish environmental benefits of environmental measures.
Thank you. Let's see if Jana Dreyer can connect. I'll take another question in the meantime. Okay, we have a question from Caroline Dierbierbeck. Great point, Jim, on LDCs and CBAM. They contributed least and are most, and should surely not be those to bear the burden. Providing money afterward is an uncertain promise. The same country were promised technology transfer and climate finance, neither of which have occurred on the scale promised. So it was just a comment.
The commenter is absolutely correct. I think they said what I just said.
Yeah, exactly.
So I agree with it.
Yeah, sorry.
Can I just add really briefly on that as well? I mean, I absolutely agree as well. And I mean, just from personal experience, a couple of years ago, I did a lot of traveling around the Pacific. And, you know, I guess it wasn't until I went to countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu, whose highest point above sea level is like 2 meters, you know, where like the impact of what climate change will do really, really hits home. You know, and these are countries, you know, like you've said, that have done absolutely nothing to cause this. And I guess that as well just brings home to me, like, yes, we have to deal with this competitiveness, you know, concern, but just the importance of actually making sure that countries feel enabled to take climate measures in the first place, which sort of circles back to the importance of having this conversation in the WTO and getting, you know, a waiver or whatever the best option we can get to get this working.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a question related to Tracy. Because of likely mixed motives in climate measures, a waiver seems needed. Judge Backus at the very end added that a waiver would nonetheless include the requirements of the chapeau of GATT Article 20. This is understandable. However, given what cryptic case law on that language, would this perhaps not require an elaboration so as not to be a higher bar? To me, it seems that that very language has been used to thwart measure with mixed motives. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that the question of mixed motives is something that is not unique to climate change, right? It comes up in the health area as well, and, you know, technical barriers to trade. I mean, certainly, you know, panels in the appellate body, I think, can deal with it. And yeah, I mean, I guess to me, it feels as if the chapeau language has worked pretty well in trying to sift out, you know, what is genuine and what's not. You know, James has a lot more experience on the ground, so I can probably speak, you know, better to that. But I guess I'd be reluctant to try to get too specific, and you know, I guess sometimes the perfect can be the enemy of the good. You know, we could spend a lot of time trying to craft, you know, even more precise language about how to sift out, you know, where a motive is maybe more one way than the other. But I guess in the end, we have to accept there will be mixed motives and do the best we can. And it seems to me the language works pretty well.
Thank you, Tracy. Maybe a question for Jean-Marie. What the EU's considerations to LDC, what we discussed basically a few minutes ago?
Well, I think this is a very important point that I'm taking away, at least from this conversation, and we already had in mind. The EU process is ongoing, so I think this is feeding it, and it's very important to feed it. And there were, for instance, recently a dialogue between my authorities and the DG of the WTO, and the new DG mentioned that point of just climate transition. And I think we all agree that this has to be framed in. I think it's very interesting the way that James has been mentioning it as a subcomponent or some sort of a options, just like in the trade facilitation agreement. So I cannot give you a definitive answer, obviously, because we are waiting for the proposition from the Commission, but I think it's a very, very important input into the discussion. And we are obviously wanting to take that into account. I mean, the carbon adjustment mechanism is not designed to be a punishment mechanism. It is designed to lead toward fighting climate change and getting everybody involved.
It must be added, there are two dimensions to carbon leakage. One is a competitiveness concern, the other is climate concern. It does absolutely no good for the climate if one country imposes restrictions on emissions and those emissions are simply shifted offshore. I think the notion of climate-related carbon leakage is very real. With respect to competitiveness leakage, there's not so much empirical evidence suggesting that it's real, but in politics, perception is reality. And therefore, it's real for the politicians who are going to be voting on these measures, not only in Europe, but in the United States and elsewhere. So as a practical matter, the competitiveness concerns have to be addressed. My goal would be to mitigate how they are addressed in a way that would create the right balance in serving the interests of both trade and climate mitigation and adaptation.
Thank you. We have now a question from Jana Dreyer, Borderlex. She's asking, how could one go about starting to build momentum for the WTO Climate Waiver proposal in Geneva these days? Isn't everyone focused on fishery subsidies and COVID-19?
Well, if you want, I can try to step in on this one.
Thank you.
Stephanie. Good afternoon, Jana. I would not say, I would not answer the question about building momentum toward a climate waiver, because first, personally, I'm very sympathetic to the climate waiver, but I'm not completely convinced myself. So, but the question is building momentum toward a discussion on climate change in the WTO. And I think here there are signals that it might be possible in the coming months. There have been a paper, for instance, introduced by Japan on carbon neutrality, to open a discussion on carbon neutrality. The EU is also coming with an initiative on climate change, which will be more focusing on the liberalization of trade and of goods and services contributing to climate change. So that is not the end of the climate story, but that can be a starting point, which is important to start to just naturally install this discussion in the WTO. There might be in the first step a need for a plurilateral approach for this. It remains to be seen, given the difficulties that I previously mentioned about opening a climate change discussion, even in the Committee on Trade and Environment. So I think things are coming, and there are those initiatives where there will be a possibility to be done. Obviously, what I'm saying is not as ambitious as opening a climate waiver discussion. I'm not necessarily pushing for that, but climate first, and then we'll see how we deal with the different legal aspects of the discussion.
Thank you. Maybe I take another one from Reinhard Quick, probably for you, Jean-Marie. Can the CTE develop a sustainable solution under the threat of an EU unilateral trade measure? The Paris Agreement requires a non-punitive implementation of the Paris commitment, yet the EU will introduce nothing else but such a punitive measure. That's the way he sees things, but...
Well, I just do strongly disagree with the idea of that being a punitive approach. I think that maybe from a trade perspective, if you have only a trade perspective, you may think that it's a punitive approach. Actually, this is leading toward fighting climate change, and it is leading toward decarbonating the economy, which allows me to touch upon the point that Emily raised about the sectoral approach. We have indications, for instance, that in the steel sector, there are investments on decarbonated steel production, which could be made if there was this carbon adjustment mechanism. And these investments are not happening now because of the risk of not being profitable enough, because it raises the cost. So I think the carbon adjustment mechanism of the EU should be seen first and foremost as what it is. It is a formidable incentive to try to promote investment, decarbonating the economy. Now, the rest of it is about how do we deal with the interface with trade, and I think the EU is very clear on this. We want to do that in a WTO compatible manner. We want to listen on what other countries are doing. We want to integrate their policies so that we are acting in a non-discriminatory manner. We believe, at least for France, that it's absolutely possible to do that under Article 2 or 3 of the GATT without resorting to the Article 20. If needed, we'll see. What other legal solutions are. But it's not absolutely a unilateral and punitive measures. Now for the CTE, there will be probably presentation by the EU when time comes of our ideas within the CTE, and they will be discussed. So I'm quite confident it can still be a constructive approach. Now it's true that what James suggested as premises is that for me the question is not, is it going to happen? The question is it going to happen in a multilaterally constructive manner or not? And we are still working for the first option.
Thank you. So I'm picking up on that, and also one of the questions that John Magnus asked about the policy space. That he probably thinks that the current legal framework allows some policy space, which is true, but to what extent, that the question. And Tracy, you just replied that, yeah, in any event, those measures will be challenged. And we will need to wait for a while before it's actually settled. And I would like also to ask you what you can foresee if actually we find no solution and rely exclusively on dispute settlement and this unilateral measure proliferate. Can't you foresee maybe a problem of, as people say, green trade war? With retaliation measures, possibly, or maybe other unilateral measures that would be protectionist. What do you think about it?
I think there will be retaliation measures. Tracy, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, very happy for you to answer that. I was just going to say on dispute settlement, I mean, one of the things I guess that had concerned me as well was a potential chilling effect. Yeah. You know, if a country takes a measure and then everyone else thinks, oh, well, we'll wait to see what dispute settlement, you know, says about that. So that was sort of the angle I'd probably been coming from. So just, yeah, really interested to hear from James on the retaliation side of things.
Also, yeah, it was one of my questions at the beginning about the chilling effect. Do you think there is a real chilling effect to this, or is it a real problem or just theoretical?
As I said at the outset, I don't think we're going to see the situation in which the Europeans propose this and then everybody waits until someone brings a case against the Europeans in the WTO, and then they wait until the outcome of that case before they take any climate action. I think what we're going to see instead is emulation of the European Union, probably first by the United States, then maybe by other developed countries, and retaliation by developing countries against the Europeans and others who enact similar measures, all of it leading to a whole spate of WTO litigation, and leading, in the absence of an amendment to the rules or a waiver, to WTO judges deciding what are climate measures that are legitimate and what are not for the 164 members of the COP who are also members of the WTO. I think that's what's more likely, and as I see it, only a waiver can help us avoid that at this point. I say that because, again, as I said at the outset of our discussion, I believe it would be a relatively simple matter to pass border tax adjustments in the form of carbon taxes that would be legal under the current rules, would not require a defense under Article 20, and would not require a waiver. But the Europeans are not going to do that. As my friend Steve Charnovich said the other day, and we're both supporters of our new president, President Biden seems more inclined to tax income than emissions. And there's no real call in the Congress, even on the Democratic side, for a carbon tax. And I don't see other countries weighing in to focus on carbon taxes as climate measures. And there are dozens of them in place around the world. I think Canada's maybe ahead of some other countries in taking this approach. But most likely we're going to see non-tax forms of trade restrictions for climate reasons. And they are fraught with WTO legal difficulties under the current rules.
Thank you. So we're approaching the end of our webinar. So I would like to add to ask you whether you want to add something before we end it. No one? So, well, thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to the attendees and our guests. Thank you so much.
Very greatly appreciate it.
Thanks.
My best to all.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Great moderation, and to the fellow panelists for organizing all of this today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.